If what this alien said about 2026 is true, we are not ready. The sentence lands like a bell in the middle of a quiet room. It is not shouted. It is the kind of truth that slides in and settles under the ribs, making you breathe differently. Picture a small workshop on the edge of a New England town, a place filled with cedar dust, smell of oil and lemon wax, a radio that never seems to pick up anything more than static. There is a single lamp over a worn workbench. A clock above the door ticks. Outside, a cardinal lands on the feeder and gives 3 sharp notes, then pauses as if listening for something beyond the backyard pines. Paul Stevens lived in that room. At 69, he had the hands of a man who had learned to coax beauty out of rough boards, veins mapped like rivers, nails silvered with decades of work, a faint scar along the left thumb where a blade had slipped years ago. He lived alone since Linda's funeral 2 winters earlier. Linda had been the kind of person who left small light traces, her mug, a sweater on the back of a chair, the sound of a laugh recalled like a color when Paul closed his eyes. Those traces did not go away. They moved through him like music. For months, the music had taken shape into a narrower set of patterns. The same dream 3 nights running. The same numbers appearing on receipts, clocks, license plates. 3 cardinals showing up in odd places. He woke at 2:17 a.m. almost every night, eyes wide, chest tight, as if the house itself had remembered something. Grief had kept him awake. So had curiosity. He kept a small notebook on his bedside table and wrote down what the dreams felt like. More than content, the feeling of being between 2 rooms, of standing with someone whose hand was warm but invisible. On the pages, his handwriting bent toward the margins like branches seeking sun. In the months before the visitation, neighbors began leaving small things at his door: a jar of jam, a newspaper with a story circled, a handwritten note asking if he needed help. Diane, who lived 3 doors down and had once owned a meditation class at the community center, took to sitting with him on slow afternoons, making tea and asking quiet questions. Paul would listen and nod and then go back to his sanding, motion that soothed him like a metronome. These were not dramatic preludes. They were eccentricities that might have been dismissed as the quirks of an older man. But they accumulated, like sap building under bark, until something in him gave way to a different kind of openness. The evening of the visitation was ordinary in every small way, until it was not. It was late winter, the kind of night where the dark has an edge to it, the stars flattened by a thin, dry air. Paul had stayed up too late cleaning a walnut table. The lamp over his bench threw a cone of light that made the dust motes visible, little planets in slow, aimless orbit. He finished the last pass with fine sandpaper, set the block down, and went to the kitchen for coffee. The clock read 2:40 a.m. He would later say that it began with a sound, low and not unkind, like wind moving through tall reeds. It is important to say he did not hear it with his ears first. He felt it as a pressure in the middle of his forehead, a tiny insistence that something wanted his attention. The cardinals outside took flight and then fell silent, as if even birds hold their breath sometimes. When Paul opened the workshop door, the air felt different. The light outside was bluish and silver, a color he would spend days trying to match with words and failing. There was a shape in the lawn, not like a craft he had seen in movies, but like a bead of mercury blown up to human scale, smooth, spherical, faintly luminous. It hovered a foot above the grass, no noise but for that soft reed-like tone. Paul's first practical thought was, the battery in the neighbor's lantern must have blown into a strange frequency. His second practical thought was that he needed to go back inside and call someone. Instead, he kept walking forward. The being that emerged, if that is the right word, was tall and long-limbed, movement like water pushed between stones. Skin, if you could call it that, caught the silver light and bent it so that no distinct color lay upon it.
What struck Paul immediately was not the shape, but the sense of recognition that came with a warmth like the memory of his wife's hand in his. It did not speak aloud. The message arrived in him as if someone had placed a gentle palm over his mind and pressed. Paul later struggled to keep the words exact. He held on to phrases like driftwood. The being's communication, in the account he gave, was a tapestry of images and words, clear one moment, impression the next. For the purposes of anyone who would listen, Paul told them as he received it. A voice without sound said his name. It recalled the nights he had woken at 2:17, the day Linda left him a folded paper with nothing written on it but 2 initials, the exact smell of her lemon hand cream. The being did not mock. It simply catalogued, as though to tell Paul that he was seen. Then the subject shifted, and the interior of Paul's head opened as though a window had been thrown wide. He saw, according to his telling, 2 images at once, overlapping and offset like 2 photographs slightly misaligned. One image vibrated lower, slightly gray around the edges. The other shone with a pale, warm saturation. Through the overlapping images, the being conveyed what it called a bifurcation. Paul did not use that technical term at first. The being's translation gave him the word later. It spoke in a metaphor Paul could grasp. Radio stations filling the same air, but tuned to different frequencies. In the vision shown to Paul, humanity's choices, emotions, habits, and attention acted like tuning dials.
From 2026 to 2033, the being insisted, according to the visitation, there would be a gradual separation, a slow leaning apart, a kind of folding where 2 related but distinct realities would become more and more isolated from one another. If what this alien said about 2026 is true, we are not ready. Paul would repeat the sentence later, less as a prediction and more as an assessment of condition. The readiness not of equipment but of inner life. The being, without drama, showed him what those 2 realities might look like. In the lower frequency image, everyday things acquired a thin film of static. A hospital room was bright and efficient but lonelier. Faces passed through procedures with a sense of urgency that never softened into tenderness. Conversations felt transactional. Words replaced empathy. Gardens existed but were fenced and tended from a distance. People ate food grown for efficiency, not taste. Houses stood like museum pieces with no repair of the small human things. Families sat at separate tables to avoid the friction of difference. Technology, abundant, grew brittle. Communication that once bound people together missed meetings and misdelivered calls. Screens froze at crucial moments, and maps refused to match the terrain. The weather seemed meaner, soil tired. There were more locks. Fear created systems that compressed care into checklists. In the higher frequency image, things moved with a different gravity. A hospital room hummed in a softer register. Nurses lingered longer, not from inefficiency, but from an unhurried attention that allowed small restorative gestures. Neighborhoods had orchards in common spaces. Children ran with scraped knees and confident laughter, and adults returned to the habit of facing one another in conversation. Food had texture and season. People shared what they had. Technology was still present, but served as a tool rather than an axis. Its glitches rare and more like reminders that the world is not entirely under human control. People remembered things differently. They found ways to help the stranger in the grocery line, as if the stranger was, in truth, a neighbor temporarily unrecognized. There was, in the vision, a greater willingness to stay with discomfort and soften it with attention. These were images, not proofs. Paul always said that. He said that the being emphasized choice and practice, that the split would not be a grand theatrical event on a single day, but a pattern emerging over years, the result of repeated small acts. The language of higher and lower did not carry an edge of judgment in the vision. It was presented more like 2 possible states that come from long habits of attention and reaction. The being used an analogy Paul remembered. 2 radio channels are both on the air. Which one you land on depends on what you habitually tune your life to, fear or curiosity,
withdrawal or connection, reactivity or presence.
After that part of the vision, the being communicated 7 simple choices, daily practices it framed as ways to adjust one's tuning. The being did not promise that these actions would guarantee anything. It used the verb raise in a tentative way and showed Paul small vignettes of what consistent practice might yield. A warmth returning to a strained conversation, an unearned calm in a frantic moment, a neighbor lifting a hand to help without calculating return. The 7 choices came packaged as practical, humble, and repeatable. Paul wrote them down on a card and kept it folded in his wallet like a talisman. The first practice the being emphasized was gratitude, not as an abstract sentiment, but as a disciplined doorway. Paul had always been a man of work, not of mornings with lists of thanks. Still, the being suggested a practice no longer than 5 minutes. Settle, breathe, and name 3 simple things in the present moment for which you are grateful. Paul's example was small and stubbornly ordinary. The way a plank of cherry had taken stain evenly. The fact that the kettle began to sing just as he finished his reading. The memory of Linda tucking a note into his pocket. He tried it that night at 2:55 a.m. with the cardinal's 3 notes still ringing in his ears, and found his shoulders drop a fraction. It did not cure insomnia. It placed a pebble in the stream of his worry and watched the ripples slow. The second practice was conscious work, presence in the task at hand. The being compared it to tuning a string rather than striking a bell. In Paul's life, that meant returning to the bench and doing one deliberate action, planing a board with attention to the grain, noticing the smell of cut wood, feeling the rhythm of the hand. He learned to let the motion be his meditation. If it was a day for spreadsheets rather than sandpaper, the practice translated: bring full presence to the cursor, to the next email, to the breath before you send the message. Paul's concrete example: while repairing an old chair for a neighbor, he paused between each sanded pass, breathed, and set the tool down in such a way that the motion became an act of care rather than a step toward finishing. Practice 3 was daily nature connection. The being did not demand long pilgrimages into wilderness. It suggested small habitual contacts: a 5-minute walk barefoot on cool grass, watching the light on a neighbor's bird bath, standing by a window and tracing the trajectory of a cloud. Paul's image was literal and tactile. He put his hands in dirt, planted a single row of beans in a patch of soil by the fence, and kept a small glass on his workbench with pebbles and a sprig of rosemary. The act returned his feet to the earth. He noticed the neighbor's dog press against his leg one afternoon, as if approving the decision. Forgiveness was the 4th practice, not presented as an act of religious duty, but as an unshackling. The being characterized forgiveness as a lowering of the volume of grievance so that quieter things, connection, curiosity, repair, could be heard again. Paul's starting point was internal. Forgive the self for leaving dishes in the sink. Forgive the living for the times they had failed him. Forgive Linda for leaving, not in the sense of blame, but to release the charge that kept their absence sharp. He wrote a letter to Linda and did not send it. He read it aloud once in the workshop and folded the page into the wood-stained box. He felt something soften each time he read that private, clumsy confession. The 5th practice, the being suggested, was simple service, small acts offered without calculation. The idea was not to become ideologically charitable, but to shift the habitual posture of the heart from "what will I get" to "what can I give?" Paul's example was literal and gentle. He began delivering an extra loaf of bread to the woman across the street whose knees did not like snow. He fixed a neighbor's broken chair without asking for anything in return. The acts were not dramatic rescues, they were small stitches. People returned his kindness with smiles, with eggs left at his door, with conversation stretched longer than before. None of this felt like proof, but it felt like soil. The 6th practice was dialogue with loved ones across boundaries, an instruction to practice deliberate listening and to learn to speak from the inside.
The being framed this less as a metaphysical instruction and more as a recalibration of how people relate. Really hear, really show up, and take seriously the possibility that relationships contain many subtle frequencies. For Paul, that meant calling his estranged brother, listening without the urge to defend history, and reading aloud letters Linda had once chosen not to send. He practiced asking one question and waiting 30 seconds for the answer, without interrupting. The exercise was awkward at first, and then, in small, startling ways, became a bridge. The seventh practice was building conscious community, finding or forming small groups that held consistent practices and met with the express intention of tending frequency together. The being suggested that small groups could create a shared field of attention, a kind of mutual tuning. Paul's first attempt was clumsy. He phoned Diane, who had the meditation class, and asked if she knew anyone who would meet once a week just to sit for 10 minutes and share one small life update. Diane said yes immediately, as if she had been waiting for an excuse. They called for 2 neighbors on the block, one of whom brought her knitting, another who brought a thermos of tea. They ate in the kitchen and sat for 5 minutes of quiet. It felt both absurd and vital, like practicing a language in a country where one has been mute for too long.
Each practice was paired, in the being's presentation, with tiny measurable changes. Less reactivity, an increase in small kindnesses, a sense that people began to remember one another more reliably. The being insisted, always in conditional phrases according to Paul, that none of these were guarantees. They were ways to nudge a life's tuning, to make the radio dial more likely to catch a channel that hummed with connection rather than fear. Paul tried the practices imperfectly and with a stubborn, ordinary human resistance. He missed days. He forgot to call his brother. Some nights he sat with the gratitude card like a stone in his pocket and felt nothing. Then a week passed in which a neighbor left a jar of plum jam and an apology for a late payment, and Paul realized he had smiled more that week. The cardinals that had been motifs in his life appeared 3 mornings running at the feeder, then circled his porch 3 times and left. He took this as a sign, or, he told himself, a sign might be only coincidence. The ambiguity mattered less than the gradual change in the furniture of his day. It is important to emphasize, in Paul's telling, the being did not say this would be easy. It did not say people who failed to practice would be punished. The vocabulary the being used, again, as relayed by Paul, was more like weather than judgment. Tendencies, leanings, friction, resonance. The invitation was to attend, to practice, to see what small changes occurred in one's capacity to be present. By the time the being had concluded its list, the light on the lawn had thinned and a sphere hovered a little higher. It conveyed, in the last soft images, some of the external signs that might accompany the slow bifurcation from 2026 through 2033. Paul's notebook would later show a messy list, scrawled in the margins between gratitude and conscious work. Losing people in ways that refuse explanation. Families remembering events differently. Communications that fail at key moments. Places that no longer feel like they should on a map. These were examples, he said, not prophecies sealed in stone. He saw a scene, one of many, that stayed with him. 2 siblings at a kitchen table arguing over whether a cousin had attended last year's funeral. One insisted she was there and described a coat. The other denied it. The argument was not about memory alone. It had the texture of 2 people inhabiting slightly different versions of the same past. In another image, a man walked out of a grocery store and found the layout changed. Shelves in different places. He stood and waited for a map that did not come. There were images of communication failures, calls that could not connect during an emergency, GPS signals that hopped and froze. There were also quieter images, a friend who vanished from the neighborhood's shared chat, a cafe that people swore had once existed where a dentist's office now stood. These were examples, he said, not prophecies sealed in stone. He saw a scene, one of many, that stayed with him. 2 siblings at a kitchen table arguing over whether a cousin had attended last year's funeral. One insisted she was there and described a coat. The other denied it.
The argument was not about memory alone. It had the texture of two people inhabiting slightly different versions of the same past. In another image, a man walked out of a grocery store and found the layout changed. Shelves in different places. He stood and waited for a map that did not come. There were images of communication failures, calls that could not connect during an emergency, GPS signals that hopped and froze. There were also quieter images, a friend who vanished from the neighborhood's shared chat, a cafe that people swore had once existed where a dentist's office now stood.
Paul did not frame these images as metaphysical threats, so much as signs of a pattern that could create confusion and grief and practical hardship. The being suggested ways to respond to such moments. Ground yourself, check in with your people. Practice a breathing rhythm that returns blood to your hands. Do not assume panic will help. It recommended, according to Paul, returning to the practices: gratitude before action, presence before reaction, community before isolation. That guidance was less a set of instructions and more a tonal suggestion for how to move through disorienting moments. When the visitation ended, the being did not leave with a fanfare. It turned, extended something like an acknowledgement that felt like a bow, and the sphere that had been a footprint of light contracted and rose until it dissolved into the chill air. The cardinals resumed their chatter, as if they had merely been waiting for permission to speak again. Paul stood on his lawn and felt at once both very small and strangely animated. He had been given a sense of a timeline, a period from 2026 to 2033 in which things might shift like tectonic plates. Yet its outlines were blurry, like a map sketched in pencil and never inked. He slept for 3 hours that morning, the kind of sleep that is thin and stitched with images. When he woke, he wrote everything he could remember, filling pages with the being's images and the instructions he had been given. He did not publish or preach. He told Diane first, over 2 cups of tea, and she listened with the steadiness she had offered him since Linda died. "If you want the 7-step guide in a simple PDF," she said later, "put it in the pinned comment. People need help practicing, not just panic." It was a pragmatic suggestion. Paul agreed, not because he wanted attention, but because he had seen how small practices could change the angle at which a person entered a day. If what this alien said about 2026 is true, the immediate point was not doom, it was preparation. Paul understood it as a warning of sorts, but it was a warning shaped like a recipe book rather than a siren. The being had not specified who would be on which strand of the bifurcation. It suggested tendencies. It recommended daily habits. It emphasized that the split would be gradual, that people could shift their tuning with consistent attention, and that the real resource was practice done day after day. Paul began to experiment. His trials were not dramatic. They were the modest acts of an ordinary life reoriented by intention. He found that gratitude 5 minutes in the morning anchored a restless day. Presence during his work kept his mind from reeling into rumination and made his hands steadier. Standing barefoot for 2 minutes on the cold grass in the garage doorway felt, embarrassingly, like prayer. Calling his brother became less about settling an old score and more about listening. If what this alien said about 2026 is true, the immediate point was not doom, it was preparation. Paul understood it as a warning of sorts, but it was a warning shaped like a recipe book rather than a siren. The being had not specified who would be on which strand of the bifurcation. It suggested tendencies. It recommended daily habits. It emphasized that the split would be gradual, that people could shift their tuning with consistent attention, and that the real resource was practice done day after day. Paul began to experiment. His trials were not dramatic. They were the modest acts of an ordinary life reoriented by intention. He found that gratitude 5 minutes in the morning anchored a restless day. Presence during his work kept his mind from reeling into rumination and made his hands steadier.
Standing barefoot for 2 minutes on the cold grass in the garage doorway felt embarrassingly like prayer. Calling his brother became less about settling an old score and more about listening.
The conscious community, 4 neighbors meeting on Tuesday nights, became a place where someone brought soup when they were tired, and someone else still came even if they had nothing to give. Within weeks, minor things shifted. A neighbor who had seemed standoffish stopped avoiding eye contact. A long-dormant friend returned a letter. Paul noticed that his dreams changed texture. Linda's presence felt less like a wound and more like a companion sitting across from him at the table. Not miraculous cures, not guaranteed escapes from suffering, just practical, human remaking. And yet, in the margins of those small changes, a broader concern lingered. The being had made the same clear point twice. The world at large, its institutions, its media, its habits, was not primed to respond with grace to the kinds of confusion the bifurcation might inflict. If, according to the visitation, between 2026 and 2033, the air itself split into overlapping realities, the immediate danger would not be spectacular destruction, but the slow erosion of trust. Neighbors who no longer agreed on what had happened, systems designed for continuity that frayed when memories diverged, families sundered by different recollections of the same event. The being suggested that panic would magnify the problem, steadiness would mitigate it. Paul understood, in a way that went beyond fear, that this was a time to practice steady presence, to learn the discipline of attention. He did not imagine that everyone would or could turn quickly to the 7 practices. He understood the compassion the being had shown toward people who might stay on the lower frequency line. Not condemnation, but recognition. That gentleness did not absolve the urgency. The phrase kept running through him like a footnote. If what this alien said about 2026 is true, we are not ready. He began to catalog things to watch for on his own. A note in his notebook read, "Signs to notice: unexpected absences, memory divergence, failed comms during crucial moments." He put the note under the card with the 7 practices. The list was not exhaustive. He told himself the point was not to become a sentinel of fear, but an observer of pattern. He also began to notice the way his neighbor across the street, a man named Harold who told long, repetitive stories, had become more withdrawn. Harold described an afternoon where he swore there had been 3 boys playing stickball in the lot, but when the other men looked, there were only 2. Harold laughed it off, but the laugh had a notch of strain. As Paul set about practicing, he had to confront the reality that preparation is not solely a matter of technique. Habits require endurance. Habits require community reinforcement. Habits must outlast novelty. He found this acutely when he missed a week of gratitude and presence because of an arthritic flare in his wrist. The slip did not undo the progress, but it showed how fragile any tuning can be. The being's suggestions were steps on a ladder. Missing a rung did not topple you, but it made climbing slower. One evening, Paul sat at his bench and noticed the light in the workshop had a warmer hue than it had months before. Maybe it was the way he had begun to notice light. Maybe it was a trick of memory. Still, he felt an odd urgency, not panic, like someone noticing the tide line on a beach and deciding to move their blanket a few yards back. It was time to practice consistently, he told himself, not for the sake of fear, but because attentive living is a better life even if the bifurcation never materialized. At the same time, he had the sense that the world outside his block was moving like a slow machine. News cycles fetched up small anomalies, people puzzling over sudden changes in neighborhood rosters, an odd surge in server outages that left communities unable to coordinate, stories of families arguing over whether someone had been at a gathering. None of these were described in the newspapers as anything more than local incidents.
In the account Paul gave, the being had warned that early signs might be drowned out by the noise of other events, and that confusion would make people hungry for simple explanations. That hunger was dangerous because it pushes toward certainty in the wrong places. Paul wanted to tell the world what the being had said. He wanted to write a clear, stamped letter to the mayor and to the local paper and to Diane's meditation group. Instead, he began small, distributing photocopies of the 7 practices in the library and slipping a copy into the community center's suggestion box. He code-smiled at the librarians and left a single flyer on the bulletin board. 7 simple choices for anyone who wanted to begin. He did not use the word alien in the flyer. He used vision and practice and community. He trusted that language would reach people where their fear could not. Weeks turned into months. He kept at the habits as best he could. He still forgot. He still had nights where everything felt like a heavy curtain. Yet other moments surprised him. A neighbor showing up with leftover soup. A phone call from a cousin he'd not heard from in years. Diane letting him take the lead in a community sitting for the first time. The practices were not flashy. They were steady, like small stones placed across a shallow stream. If what this alien said about 2026 is true, we are not ready. Paul felt the truth of that in the slow hours as much as in the bright hour of the visitation. He did not see global systems change overnight. He saw instead that if the world leaned toward fear and fragmentation, it would be much harder to live with one another. The being's message, gentle, practical, conditional, had given him a map and an instruction. Practice. Build tiny communities. Notice the signs. Attend to grief with helpers. Sit with confusion and do not let it be your only currency.
The winter edged toward spring, and Paul's notebook filled. Each practice had a page. Gratitude had a list of trifles he noticed daily. Presence had notes on tools and how he laid them down between actions. Nature connection contained sketches of the backyard. Forgiveness had a line where he wrote a single name, then crossed it out. Service had a log of small gifts he had given. Dialogue had a list of questions that opened talk rather than shut it down. Community had days and times. The list was not dogmatic. It was a way to remember. He would later tell anyone who asked that he did not feel chosen in a special way. He did not think of himself as exceptional. He was a man with a mortality and a habit of showing up. The being had chosen, in the account he gave, to appear to a life that was ordinary precisely because ordinary lives are the most frequent and therefore the most powerful sites of change. And yet there was the lingering, unavoidable backbeat, the timeline. The being had given Paul a window, 2026 to 2033, and with that came a pressure, an attempt to turn attention into action. It felt, sometimes, like the difference between moving a boulder a few inches or leaving it to roll irretrievably. The practices were not an insurance policy. They were a method of coordination with others and with the self. The being's tone suggested that the world was traveling in a direction few were noticing. The 2 earths were not entirely separate worlds of angels and devils. They were possible states born of choices taken again and again. Paul walked through town sometimes with his palms in his pockets, eyes on the horizon line, thinking of the people who would not change because they could not, would not, or simply had no practice to turn toward. He did not judge. The visitation, according to his telling, had not offered moral superiority, only technique. The only moral imperative the being seemed to care about was kindness practiced daily. As spring unfurled, small anomalies kept appearing. A friend texted about a neighbor who claimed to have attended an event that no one else recalled. A news story ran about a small coastal town where 2 maps disagreed about a shoreline. Paul's comfort was fragile. His practice felt like a raft. He took solace in the fact that some of his neighbors had joined the Tuesday night sitting. He found that the shared, quiet attention of a room produced less drama and more small repairs. A soup offered, a chair mended, a hug given with no strings attached. Still, even as his immediate circle moved, the larger world churned in rhythms he did not control.
The being's warning, if it was a warning at all, implied a duty to spread what he could while holding compassion for those who could not or would not hear. The moral question was not, in his mind, about who deserved help. It was about how to help without making people feel broken for their current state. One afternoon, Paul received an unusual phone call.
It was not from a conspiracy theorist or a tabloid investigator. It was from a local pastor who had heard some version of the story from a mutual friend. The pastor wanted to meet, not to debate, but to understand whether Paul's practices might be useful to his congregation in a way that did not proselytize. Paul agreed. Over coffee at a small diner, they spoke about grief and practice and the possibility of holding a group that would teach the 7 choices in a neutral way. The pastor hesitated at the word alien, but he liked the idea of daily practices for attention. He proposed offering a room. Paul felt the same ambivalence the being had shown. The message was not to convert, but to practice. He found himself increasingly aware of how language shapes reception. To call the visitor an intelligence or a being or an alien made people recoil or lean in. To call the guidance a vision softened some reactions. He learned the art of translation not only in the being's images, but in practical life. How to render strange things in ordinary vernacular so that people would take small steps toward steadiness. The weeks built into months, and the calendar crept toward the fateful year the being had noted. Paul imagined the stretch from 2026 to 2033 as a doorway that was opening incrementally. He did not expect a single dramatic revelation, no apocalypse in the streets. He expected confusion, misremembered moments, systems that groaned, and human beings who would need each other's steadiness. He did not feel heroic. He felt like a man with a list and a lamp, trying to keep it lit. It is here, as winter began to think about receding, that the account deepened into practical instructions for recognizing early symptoms, ways to avoid turning disorientation into panic. But those descriptions are tangled with a larger question. What do you do when the map you used to navigate life no longer lines up? Paul's notes begin to show the strain between theory and application. He wrote possible responses. Breathe, gather, check facts, lean into practice, avoid scapegoating, and hold compassion for those who felt lost. At this juncture, the narrative pauses to gather breath. The practices are in place, the initial reactions swelling and settling. There are hints of public signs and private fractures, but the fuller arc, how communities will respond, which systems will hold and which will strain, how the 7 practices will fare under stress, remains to be tested. Paul kept sanding, kept calling his brother, kept meeting with Diane and the neighbors. He continued to carry the card with the 7 choices in his wallet. The world outside kept its complicated hum. If what this alien said about 2026 is true, we are not ready. It is a claim that insists on action of a particular kind, not frantic stockpiling or withdrawal, but steady, communal practice. Paul's life had shifted in small ways. He had become, in his own modest sense, a practitioner of attention. Whether that would be enough for the wider changes the being had sketched would, according to the way he told it, depend less on prophets and more on folks who learned to be present for one another in the ordinary transactions of life. There is a space here, in the middle of the story, the place where preparation meets uncertainty, where the next steps begin to press. The path forks into public signs and private responses, into how communities respond when memories diverge and when systems falter, into the particular tests the 7 practices must endure. The light in Paul's workshop had warmed a degree. The cardinals had circled and gone. He rubbed his hands together, smelled lemon and wood, and folded the card with careful fingers. He had begun. The clock on the wall ticked, patient, marking the time between now and that uneasy horizon. The clock kept its patient tick as Paul folded the card and slid it back into his wallet.
Outside, the cardinals, those small three-note heralds, had long since returned to their ordinary chatter. But in Paul's mind, a different rhythm had begun to mark the days. A tempo of small commitments, a metronome of attention that he set and reset with each practice. He moved through the months like a man learning a new instrument, off-key at first, then finding a rough, honest tune. The town, in its ordinary ways, supplied both shelter and friction. Harold kept telling the stickball story, laughing with a string of nervousness at the end that suggested something larger pressed at the edges of his jokes. Diane organized the Tuesday sittings with a grocery list efficiency that surprised Paul. She brought a tin of ginger cookies the first week and a worn bell the second, which someone rang softly at the start and close of each meeting. The pastor's offer of a neutral room turned into a modest experiment, a single evening where Paul and Diane and a small circle taught the 7 practices in plain language. No cosmic framing, only a practical invitation to try gratitude for 5 minutes, to put attention into work, to feel the dirt beneath the soles of one's shoes, to try speaking and listening with slowness. People came out of curiosity, grief, a desire for companionship. Some left after the first meeting and never returned. One woman came every week and later told Paul she had felt less inclined to snap at her daughter. The pastor, careful and curious, said later that what people needed most was a vocabulary to point to the thing they already sensed, that life was fragmenting somewhere at the edges and that the usual certainties no longer fit as neatly. Paul kept his notebook like an altar. It held lists and sketches, the gratitude entries, a tally of missed days, the names of people he'd helped and those who helped him. When he forgot, the skipped week because his wrist flared or because a storm knocked out the power, he marked it with a small circle and returned forgivingly.
The being had framed practice as a leaning, not a test. Paul took that counsel to heart. It allowed him to be stubborn without becoming harsh toward himself. A slow season of anomalies began to gather, each small and easily reported away. A neighbor who swore his porch had held a blue bicycle that no one else remembered. A schoolteacher's record of attendance that failed to match a parent's memory. A server outage that left several towns blocked from a critical municipal billing portal for a day. Journalists called some incidents quirks. A few people started collecting them, folders of oddities that were rarely coherent when placed together. Paul saved clippings and scribbled notes, labeling some files patterns and others maybe nothing. Then the pattern pressed closer. A family 2 streets over found themselves arguing for days about whether there had been a cousin at last year's reunion. The argument stopped being about the cousin and became about trust. A local man, a volunteer firefighter, walked into the station during a drill and insisted he'd been at a training the previous week that none of his colleagues accepted as having occurred. He felt stranded inside a mismatch between his memory and the station's records. For him, the experience folded into shame. He apologized for the confusion and then drove home like someone stranded in a stretch of fog. When small discrepancies accumulate, they tend to profile as simple human error at first. But when they cluster in time and in relationships, they make living awkward. The being had shown Paul scenes like this, not to frighten him, but to impress upon him the social texture of the bifurcation. In Paul's telling, the risk was less of cosmic fireworks than of an erosion, the steady wearing down of common ground that allows neighbors to agree on the shape of a day. Paul's own life offered a different kind of evidence, the slow interior recalibration he felt when he practiced. One morning, after a week of steady habits, gratitude at sunrise, an hour of presence at the bench, 2 minutes barefoot in the yard, he slipped a hand into his pocket and found Linda's folded handkerchief from years ago. The scent was faint, lemon and dust. He pressed the cloth and, by degrees, felt a kind of company in the workshop that was less about longing and more about steady companionship. A neighbor read his note about the gratitude practice and replied that morning with a basket of eggs and a short letter. "Your note made me try saying thanks before I left for work. I noticed the sun on the road. Thank you."
These small correspondences were not proof. Paul said that often. They were, at best, indicators that practicing changed how he moved through the world. The being had insisted on that modesty. Practice nudges the dial. It does not order fate.
As anomalies multiplied in town and beyond, Paul compiled a list of external symptoms the being had shown him in the visitation, phrases and vignettes written in a hurried hand. He polished that list into a clearer set of 7 things to watch for, each with a practical response. He shared this list quietly with Diane, with the pastor, and with the Little Tuesday group. He printed copies in the library and slipped one into the community center's drawer. The 7 symptoms, as Paul organized them in his notes, were offered again in the cautious language he had learned to use. According to the visitation, in the vision shown to me, these may be early indicators. They were not prophecies, they were watchwords. First, memory divergence. Friends or family remember the same event differently in ways that are more than simple disagreement, recollections that feel irreconcilable, not merely flawed. How to respond? Pause before insisting on one's own version. Document calmly what you recall, dates, photos, receipts. Gather more witnesses. Avoid escalation. Work from curiosity rather than accusation. Keep a log if this becomes recurrent. If distress increases, seek a counselor to process the emotional fallout rather than rely on speculation. Second, disappearing presences. People who are no longer reachable by usual means, not always in a criminal sense, but in the sense of they no longer appear in my usual life. It looks like a person removed from a social feed, a neighbor who ceases to show up where she used to, or someone who seems suddenly absent from shared rituals. How to respond? Check practical explanations first, work schedules, travel, health, then communicate with mutual friends. Avoid rumors and create a watchful but measured circle of care. Maintain records of communications and ask local authorities only when safety is at stake. Third, failing communications at crucial moments. Calls that drop during moments of need, mapping programs that misroute ambulances, or sudden blackout of community coordination platforms. How to respond? Cultivate multiple forms of contact with your closest people, phone, text, and face-to-face where possible. Develop a simple community check-in routine. Designate a neighbor who can do rounds if digital lines fail. Keep physical copies of essential contacts. Do not allow one technology to be the only bridge. Fourth, geographic unsettlement. Places that no longer sit right, a storefront that seems to have been different, a route that feels strangely altered, landscapes that appear rearranged in small ways. How to respond? Document with photos and timestamps. Create a shared folder with neighbors so that records exist beyond individual memory. Approach changes with curiosity, not accusation, and prioritize staying calm for practical navigation. Fifth, administrative inconsistencies. Records, calendars, or legal documents that fail to align. Someone shows up on a roster that another insists is empty, or a permit that's claimed to have been issued is untraceable. How to respond? Slow down bureaucratic processes. Copy relevant documents to multiple trusted parties. When possible, seek verification in writing. Keep calm and seek mediation rather than assuming malfeasance. Sixth, social fracturing. Families and small communities begin to split along lines of differing remembrances or differing habit patterns. Some people find themselves increasingly isolated simply because they inhabit a different rhythm. How to respond? Practice the arts of listening and bridge making. Use the 7 practices to foster shared fields of attention. Resist shaming or binary judgments. Consider facilitated meetings with neutral practitioners who can help hold space. Seventh, amplified fear economies. A rise in systems that commodify security. Locking everything behind subscription services, increased surveillance framed as protection, or a culture that exchanges empathy for transactional checks. How to respond? Invest in human-scale mutual aid. Build small reciprocal networks that resist commodification. Protect vulnerable people with compassion. Choose practices that keep the heart open rather than closing. For each symptom, Paul wrote down a small set of actions. Mostly non-technical, almost banal, things any neighbor could do. Call someone you trust. Document what you see. breathe, hold space, ask a question rather than make an accusation. He included a preliminary list of resources where people could find neutral mediators and licensed counselors. He marked in red the caution to never use these suggestions as substitutes for professional help when medical or legal concerns were present. The being had shown him images of these disturbances not to incite a mass withdrawal from life, but to teach a posture, steadiness before panic. Paul tried to live into that posture. When Harold began to withdraw, Paul went over with a repaired lawn chair and a jar of raspberry jam. They sat, Harold telling some version of the stickball story, Paul listening with his hands spread over the warm wood like a benediction. No miracle happened. Harold still puzzled at the gaps in recollection, but he laughed more often that week. He came back to the Tuesday meetings once, then sporadically. These small returns mattered. As the calendar approached 2026 in the public sphere, a heavier weather settled across broader networks. The news, which still organized itself around major events and ratings, occasionally folded in vignettes that matched what Paul and others were seeing locally. Mismatched rosters, baffling tech outages at inconvenient times, a regional ferry rerouting that left travelers muttering about maps. Headlines framed these as infrastructure problems, as human error, as the expected hiccups of a complex system. Individuals felt something else under those headlines: dissonance. The being had emphasized that the bifurcation would not arrive like a curtain falling on a single day. It would be a slow texture change, like the fading of a color into a different hue. Paul imagined the years from 2026 to 2033 in three broad phases, not as prophecy, but as a useful way to orient preparedness. Phase 1, the noticing years, 2026 through 2028. Small anomalies cluster and grow more noticeable. Communities that practice attention begin to notice patterns sooner. Confusion is attributed to bad memory or software bugs. Here, the best response is to build reliable practices and begin to document changes without dramatizing them. Focus on small-scale mutual aid and shared records. Phase 2, the friction years, 2028 to 2031. Divergence becomes socially consequential. Some systems strain under conflicting accounts, and relationships experience real tests. People may feel more isolated, and institutions may respond with standardization that feels cold. Here, communities that already cultivated trust have an advantage. They can practice mediation and mutual care. Emphasize psychological support, robust communication backups, and public practices that foster shared attention. Phase 3, the settling years, 2031 to 2033. Patterns that persist accrete into more durable differences. By the end of the window, people may experience life that feels qualitatively different depending on the habits they have practiced over the previous years. The being had not used language of doom. Rather, it pictured a world with two coexisting grooves into which people gradually fell according to their repeated actions and habits. The being's counsel, in Paul's telling, was simple and pragmatic. Practice now, build small communities, do not make the changes into a self-fulfilling judgment against those who differ. As the years wore on, the Little Tuesday group swelled and receded in equal measure. New faces arrived: a school counselor tired of triage, a plumber who loved the idea of presence as quality control, a retired seamstress who brought a stack of quilts to share for meditation warmth. The practice sessions mutated into a loose hybrid of contemplative sitting, repair circles where people mended torn things together, and a community bulletin board of oddities and offers. The board held requests for cobblers, for someone to drive to a doctor, for a volunteer to teach basic phone skills. Paul's experiments multiplied. He recorded, with a mixture of skepticism and gratitude, the moments when the practices seemed to shift experience. A neighbor who had been curt with him for years sobbed once in his kitchen and asked him to fix an old rocker. As he did the work, Paul practiced presence as if it were an ethic and not merely a trick. The neighbor began to tell a story about a child who had once lived across the lane, someone both claimed and denied in neighborly rumors, And at the end of the repair, the neighbor hugged Paul and left a bag of pears on the doorstep. It was not cosmic proof. It was an exchange that repaired a small piece of daily life. On a winter morning when the light fell like sifted flour, Paul found himself standing on a small rise behind the workshop, the horizon showing the town's rooftops, and thinking how easily human systems could be strained by small losses of shared memory. He imagined a grocery line where two people argued about whether the product had been labeled differently last month. He imagined an elder who insisted a physician had been present for a visit that the clinic denied. These were the tragedies he feared, practical and intimate, not apocalyptic. Yet there were also moments of strange comfort. One night, in a dream that felt less like a wound and more like a visitation of steadiness, Paul sat with Linda at the kitchen table. She handed him a ceramic cup and said nothing at all. Instead, she carved the name of his neighbor's dog into the rim with a tiny, precise tool. He woke with that small, nonsensical detail lodged in his mind, and when that same neighbor later returned a lost dog to a child 2 streets over, Paul felt an odd echo that he could neither explain nor claim as proof. He took comfort in the consolation of patterns, small, mundane correspondences that suggested practice had an effect on perception and care. Not everyone met the changes with kindness. Tensions surfaced sometimes, arguments over who had the authority to declare what was real in town meetings, distrust toward outsiders who came with bold explanations, bruised feelings when someone suggested another person was wrong. The being had been compassionate in Paul's account about those who would remain on the lower frequency line. Their lives might be full and meaningful in their own ways. They might have no interest in the practices Paul proposed. The point, Paul learned, was to offer practices, not ultimatums. The moral stance he carried was less a judgment and more a persistent invitation. This posture was tested one evening when an online forum picked up a fragment of Paul's story, an offhand comment about a visitation and a list of practices, and turned it into something louder and more sensational. The thread drew attention. Some people showed up at the Tuesday meeting out of curiosity. Others wrote venomous public posts, mocking or claiming fraud. The press came, briefly, in the shape of a person with a camera who asked for a photo shot with Paul and a line that would make a good headline. Paul demurred. He allowed Diane to speak with a reporter who mostly covered the idea of community practice without invoking the visitation. The moment was wearying. It clarified something Paul already suspected. Messages like his are easier to caricature than to enact.
The being's counsel, practice, and humility felt like a shield against spectacle. A different disturbance pressed in on domestic life. Paul's brother, who had been reluctant to answer his calls, texted and then phoned from across the state. He spoke haltingly about a cousin who had reappeared in memories, and about neighbors who no longer agreed on who had hosted the last barbecue. The brother's voice had a weariness Paul recognized. Rather than argue, Paul invited him to the Tuesday sitting and promised nothing more than bread and hot tea. The brother came once, looked around like a man stepping tentatively into a new language, listened for an hour, and then left gracefully. He later sent a postcard with a sentence, "I felt less alone hearing other people confess confusion." That small admission felt like a victory. As the seasonal wheel turned, Paul noticed that his dreams continued to evolve. Linda's presence settled into a shape that was less painful and more instructive. Sometimes he dreamed of her pointing to a seed sprouting from cracked cement. At other times, she sat at the kitchen table, patient, and plied a needle through a cloth without fuss. He learned to meet these dreams with curiosity and then to return to his practices. The being, in his memory, had always emphasized practice over revelation. Now Paul felt less like a witness to a cosmic event and more like a craftsman joined to a community of craft. There were other visitors, if one could call them that, people drawn to the town who were homemakers and technicians, first responders and retired teachers, who had felt similar urges to cultivate steady attention. A woman who worked as a paramedic taught a short session on how to remain calm during emergencies without giving into panic. A librarian partnered with the pastor to create a living archive. a low-slung cabinet of photographs and receipts where neighbors could leave copies of important documents and memories in case digital records became unreliable. The archive was more symbolic than secure, but it served its purpose. It fostered a habit of preserving and sharing rather than hoarding. Paul kept notes on the small code that held the community together. Call someone before you accuse, listen twice as much as you talk, anchor yourself in a breath before responding, keep a shared physical record of things that matter. These habits were the scaffolding for what the being had called tuning, not a magical alignment, but a daily discipline that made life more navigable in the face of confusion. By the time the year 2026 arrived, the town had changed only in ways that someone outside might dismiss as incremental. There were more community wreaths and porches, and a notice board in the library full of offers and needs. There were fewer sharp arguments in the grocery line, and more people who knew one another's names.
On a morning edged with frost, Paul walked to the bench, took up a plane, and felt the tool settle like an old friend in his palm. He practiced presence until his wrists ached, and then stopped, sat on the step, and sipped coffee. The world had not split into two in the city's sky. The newspaper's most dramatic lines carried other events. But Paul had a durable intuition. A long scene had begun. Whether it would lead to fracturing or repair depended, in part, on what people did between one sunrise and the next. An event occurred that tested the town's capacity for steadiness. A beloved diner at the center of town, the place where the paper cups were still slightly translucent and the cook knew everyone's favorite eggs, announced a temporary closure because of a mechanical failure. Some people remembered the diner being closed last month for a day. Others insisted it had been open. The discrepancy ignited terse exchanges at the market. Rumors swelled that the diner was closing for good. A small panic thread emerged on a neighborhood group. The pastor proposed a meeting in the church hall to give people space to air grievances and memories in a calm environment. The Tuesday group offered to make coffee and to sit in the back to model presence. At the meeting, people spoke in different keys. Some accused others of rewriting history. Others asked quietly what mattered more, the fact of the diner's temporary closure or the loss of trust between neighbors that such a rumor had exposed. Paul listened, and then, when a lull appeared, stood up and said, in his ordinary voice, "We don't have to agree on every detail to remember we fed each other here. If a memory differs, listen. If you are angry, bring your anger here so it can be seen." The room was less theatrical than it might have been. People left with a hug, a recipe card, and an offer to walk a neighbor's dog. The episode was not an end. It was an ordinary fracture and repair. Yet it taught a lesson Paul tried to make explicit. The practices were not about making everyone remember the same thing. They were about building the muscle to respond with curiosity rather than violence, to anchor in community rather than lurching into suspicion. Over the next years, as the being had suggested in Paul's account, the world flexed and sometimes strained. Some towns fared better than others where people had begun to practice steady attention and community care. Some places doubled down on transactional protection and found themselves more brittle, less able to slow down and listen. When a hurricane skirted the coast and knocked out internet service across a wide region, towns with established physical mutual aid networks coordinated food delivery and childcare with less friction than those reliant on digital platforms alone. Paul watched from his bench as volunteers from the Tuesday group joined neighborhood teams to check on elders and deliver wood for stoves. The episode was not an end. It was an ordinary fracture and repair. Yet it taught a lesson Paul tried to make explicit. The practices were not about making everyone remember the same thing. They were about building the muscle to respond with curiosity rather than violence, to anchor in community rather than lurching into suspicion. Over the next years, as the being had suggested in Paul's account, the world flexed and sometimes strained.
Some towns fared better than others where people had begun to practice steady attention and community care. Some places doubled down on transactional protection and found themselves more brittle, less able to slow down and listen. When a hurricane skirted the coast and knocked out internet service across a wide region, towns with established physical mutual aid networks coordinated food delivery and childcare with less friction than those reliant on digital platforms alone. Paul watched from his bench as volunteers from the Tuesday group joined neighborhood teams to check on elders and deliver wood for stoves.
The experiences reinforced what the being had tried to teach. Physical proximity, practiced attention, and small rituals of care matter in unexpected ways. It is important to say, as Paul always insisted, that none of these examples proved the visitation true as a scientific fact. They were, at best, concordant with a perspective that valued small practices and community resilience. The language of the being's message, radio frequencies, tuning dials, bifurcation, was metaphorical in Paul's interpretation. Yet the metaphor seemed to hold. Repeated small actions, over time, created an emergent difference in social texture. By the later years of the window, the world felt different in ways both subtle and sharp. Paul's notebook showed a steady hand of practice. Some neighbors had grown into a discipline that made them less reactive and more generous. Others had drifted back into old patterns. When disputes flared, the community's response had improved in some places. More mediations, more people willing to sit with discomfort. In other regions, the social rifts hardened into enraged posting and defensive building of walls, literal or not. The being's vision, as Paul told it, had not assigned moral weight to either outcome. It had merely shown trajectories. Paul never received a public message from the being again. In his account, the visitation was a single event that left behind a set of practices and a vivid sense of urgency. He would sometimes stand beneath the workshop lamp, the scent of lemon hand cream in the air like a memory, and wonder whether the being's gift had been simply the translation of what many sages across cultures have taught: gratitude, service, presence, forgiveness, nature connection, attentive dialogue, and community build resilience. He suspected that was part of it. The being had made the guidance fit the language of frequency, but the actions were ancient and practical. There were moments of pain that the practices could not fully cure. A family once split when one member insisted on a memory that others could not share. Legal battles ensued, not sensational but gritty and heartbreaking. Paul sat in the courtroom once, watching, feeling suddenly very small and very human. He could see the limits of daily practice in the face of institutional force and deep hurt. The being had not promised an easy answer for such cases. The counsel had always been, practice steadiness, seek professional mediation, and keep compassion intact. Toward the closing years, Paul felt an urgency that was neither frantic nor resigned. It was an insistence on steady work. He thought of the fold between 2026 and 2033 as a doorway you might not notice until you'd already walked through it. The being's warning had been conditional, if this is accurate. That condition was a responsibility, not an exoneration. If the bifurcation was real, many people were not ready. If it was not, the practices were still worth cultivating because they made life kinder. One spring morning, an unusual quiet settled over the town, an absence of sirens and clatter, and, oddly, of the neighborhood dogs barking. Paul walked to the little hill behind his workshop and sat on the same log he had used since the visitation. The light was soft. He opened his notebook and read entries from the first year. Childish gratitude lists, shaky drawings of the bead-like ship, the first clumsy draft of the 7 practices. His hand shook a little as he wrote a new line: "We are not ready, but we can begin." He thought of Diane and the pastor, of Harold's stickball stories, of the Tuesday group and the seamstress with the quilts. He thought of Linda's handkerchief and of the cards folded in wallets across the street. He believed, in a way that was humble and stubborn, that small repeated acts would change how people lived together. He also believed that systems and institutions needed attention,
that professional help was crucial when memories diverged into crisis, and that there were no guarantees. Paul began to formalize what he had learned into a modest protocol he shared with the town, a checklist that was less about survivalism and more about daily civic care. It contained simple items: practice 5 minutes of gratitude each morning, convene a neighbor check-in once a week, keep a physical folder of important documents and photos, create a small community roster with at least 2 offline contact methods, designate a mediator in your block for disagreements, practice 1 act of service each week, agree to a pause and verify rule when memories conflict, no public shaming until a calm check is made. He gave copies to the library and to the pastor, and Diane laminated a few to hand out in the community center. The idea spread modestly. A neighboring town adopted the checklist and tailored it through their own lived experience. A small NGO republished the list with permission in a neutral pamphlet about community resilience. Paul found these developments odd and pleasing. He never asked for recognition. He wanted the practices to outlive his name. On an unremarkable afternoon, as summer eased into its fullness, Paul sat at the bench and noticed the plain's path had a steadiness he had not had months earlier. His hands were calloused and competent. A child from next door ran by with a kite and shouted hello. The world, he thought, would always surprise him. Perhaps it would bend toward care, perhaps not. The being's concern that humanity was unready in general remained a sober refrain in his life, a motivator rather than a sentence. Near the end of his notebook, he wrote a paragraph that felt like an answer to his own worry. If what the visitation suggested is true, then readiness is less about a single mass conversion and more about the accumulation of individual practices that change how people move in public.
If the world splinters into different lived textures between 2026 and 2033, then the kind of readiness that matters is relational and habitual, the willingness to show up, to listen, to repair, and to be kind. He also wrote a caveat: do not weaponize this perspective. The being had shown no contempt for those who would remain on the other strand, only compassion. Paul used that clause to refuse dividing people into in and out. He preferred to name behaviors, not souls, actions of attention, actions of withdrawal, choices that widen or narrow the field of human sympathy. As the window approached its close, Paul found himself less focused on proving anything than on tending material things: the bench, the shop light, the glass of rosemary sprigs in the corner. He built a small wooden box and carved the 7 practices into the lid. He left empty space in the box for the names of neighbors who wanted to add their own tiny rituals. The box circulated for a season. The seamstress placed a scrap of quilting fabric inside. The pastor placed a typed prayer for steadiness. Diane tucked a list of community phone numbers. The act of passing the box became a small ritual of shared attention. On the day he turned 70, a quiet party gathered on the porch. People brought bowls of stew and plates of pie. They sat in chairs that had been repaired by hands that knew how to attend. Harold told a story about a bat that had nested in the eaves. The neighbor with the dog brought a plate of cookies that had cinnamon and nutmeg. Diane leaned in and said to Paul, "You started something simple." He thought of the being's visitation, its imagery of frequencies and bifurcation, and of the careful, unglamorous labor of practice. He felt gratitude, not as a tool, but an anchored virtue. The town did not split in instant halves. Some people drifted apart from Paul's group. Others stayed. The world beyond their borders continued to hum with large-scale events: political contests, economic fluctuations, headlines that demanded attention and then moved on. Yet the tapestry of the small community held its wear. When a gust took a branch down and made power flicker, volunteers from the Tuesday group walked the neighborhood and checked on elders with flashlights and blankets. It was not dramatic, it was repair. When asked what one should do if confronted with a clearly divergent, painful memory in someone you love, Paul had a formula he repeated in small meetings: breathe, witness, record, and return to practice. Breathe to slow the automatic escalation. Witness the person's pain without leaping to correction.
Record what you both recall in a calm setting. Return to practice. Gratitude, presence, service to re-anchor the field. If the divergence produced legal, medical, or safety concerns, seek professional channels. Keep compassion at the center. As the 2033 line neared, Paul grew less rigid about dates and more attentive to habit.
He sometimes thought about the Mayan cycles that some people referenced in the margins of fringe conversations. He mentioned them only to say that cultures across time have noticed epochs and have offered rituals for transition. He did not put faith in any single culture's timetable. The being's timeline was a lens, not a creed. On the final pages of his notebook, he wrote a kind of admonition for himself and for anyone else who might hold such a warning. Do not turn this into a mania of certainty. Use it as a call to cultivate steadiness in ordinary life. The stakes, if the being was right, were real, but the remedy was not withdrawal or hoarding. It was practice, practice together, and practice with forgiveness for the people who cannot or will not do the practices. Paul's contact with Linda remained intimate and private. He wrote letters and tucked them in the carved box. Sometimes, when he felt particularly brave, he read them aloud in the workshop and imagined the words crossing a thin seam of air and being heard. He never claimed reunion as a certainty. He described connection as a rare and tender change in how absence qualified presence. The town's loose archive became a minor model for neighboring communities. The idea of civic practice, habits embedded in daily life to shore against confusion, spread in small ways. Some municipal planners began to include community-based verification methods for local events, more analog backups for digital records, and more accessible spaces for mediation. None of these were panaceas, but they were shifts in response style, not posture. In the quiet hour before dusk, Paul walked the lane and found the bench warmed by the last of a late sun. He sat, folded his hands, and breathed. Nearby, Diane tended a pot of rosemary. A child chased a kite that dipped like a gull. He thought of the sentence that had landed in the room years ago with the force of a bell. If what this alien said about 2026 is true, we are not ready. He felt the truth of that again. Global readiness remained uneven. But he also felt the humility of what little work could be done. Practice with others now. There is, he would tell anyone who asked, a practical courage in choosing to begin. It is not dramatic. It is a daily choice to notice the small things. The seam in a friendship, the taste of a local plum, the way a plank takes stain. Over time, these choices accumulate into a different social grammar, a language of attention that makes room for repair. If the world does shift in the way the being had shown him, those grammars will matter. If it does not, the grammar will still have been a good one to learn. Paul kept the card with the 7 practices in his wallet until the day he felt a little too tired to carry anything else. He taught the practice to children who drifted into the workshop to watch tools, to a nurse who came one Tuesday and later told him she used gratitude with her patients as a tiny anchor.
He never promised outcomes. He offered repetition. When he spoke publicly, rarely, he framed everything in the conditional language the being had taught him. In the account given to me, if this is accurate, according to the visitation. He used those phrases both to protect the humility of the claim and to invite people into a posture of experiment rather than conversion. If what this alien said about 2026 is true, we are not ready. Paul returned to that refrain in his private writing and his quiet conversations, not as a sentence struck from a law book, but as a sober appeal. It held urgency, yes, but also an invitation, the kind of thing that could be answered by boring, patient repetition. The final advice he wrote in the notebook, simple, unglamorous, and honest, was this: start where you are. Practice 5 minutes of gratitude in the morning. Put attention into one task you do today. Step outside and feel the ground for 2 minutes. Forgive one small thing in yourself. Do one small service for someone without calculation. Call a person and listen. Invite 3 neighbors to sit in quiet for 5 minutes and share afterward one small hope. Keep a paper folder of essentials. When anomalies appear, pause, gather witnesses, record, and be gentle. He placed the notebook back in the box and breathed again. Linda's handkerchief was folded inside the carved lid. The cardinals called from the pear tree like punctuation. The light in the workshop held a warmer hue than it had before the visitation. Perhaps that was memory playing with him. Perhaps it was the change that repetition brings. To anyone who hears the claim, the extraordinary conditional offered by a solitary man with cedar dust under his nails, there is one clear, non-technical step: begin. The bean's timeline suggested years of gradual change. That suggestion is an invitation to start today with small acts that open the heart and steady the hand. If the bifurcation imagined in Paul's vision unfolds as described between 2026 and 2033, then we stand better if we practice now. If it does not, the practices still leave the world gentler. If you want a simple, printable version of the 7 practices and the community checklist Paul organized, there is a short guide available in the pinned comment and in the description below. No charge, low pressure. Take it as one small tool, not as a promise. Try one practice today and see what shifts in the furniture of your own life. If what this alien said about 2026 is true, we are not ready. But we can begin. Will you start now?